Hello and welcome to another episode of the Lateral Think podcast. Today, I have with me Shawn Myszka. Shawn, thanks for being with us today.
Jack, my friend, I am pleased to be here at the Melbourne Athletic Development Lateral Think podcast. I'm excited to see what rabbit holes we go down and where we might find ourselves here in this discussion. I'm sure it'll be a rich one.
Well, thanks for the shout out. So, look, to begin the conversation, Shawn, do you want to explain and give us a background of who you are and what you do to give some context to the conversation?
Yeah, for sure, no doubt. And I'm sure this will be a 30,000 foot view, of course, and people can find their way into any number of places and spaces to fill in those blanks if they so desire. But I operate right now as a skill acquisition specialist working alongside of individual National Football League players here in America. So players will come to me to work on their specific gaps on the field and really kind of to tackle everything and anything around their performance with the hopes of transference, obviously, to an NFL Sunday. I didn't always exist in this place or space, of course, where I viewed myself as a skill acquisition specialist, attempting to facilitate more skillful movement behavior for players on field. I started out as a traditional S&C, as a strength and conditioning coach, working alongside of National Football League players. That's what I always had wanted to do. However, I used to take a very traditionally minded way of attacking and addressing that performance and attempting to get transfer, which kind of brought me to some of those Robert Frost moments that I so often talk about when I locked arms with my very first NFL player, attacked things traditionally, and then watch them re-enter the competitive arena that is an NFL Sunday and didn't see any difference whatsoever from the work that we had done and that which what obviously he was displaying and expressing on field. That led me down this path towards being a movement-centered coach or a movement coach. And I did that for a number of years where I really started to attack motor learning for players. But I did so again traditionally minded, chasing repetition after repetition or repetition by rote in many cases, perfect practice, if you will, because of course everybody has heard the old cliche, perfect practice makes perfect. But it wasn't until 2012 to 2013 that I began to stumble upon the ideas from an ecological dynamics framework, ideas that I'm sure we're going to talk about here today. Keith David, Eduardo Rujo, Nikolai Bernstein, J.J. Gibson, Michael Turvey, God rest his soul, like all of these people who were giants within the skill acquisition field that once I started to wrestle with some of the things that they were talking about, and I allowed that to breathe life into my living, breathing training environment, my practice environment, so there would be more aliveness within the movement problems that I would set for the players that would come to me. It wasn't until then that I really felt as though I was contributing highly to the success that my players were finding on field. And now, granted, I'm going to call out the elephant in the room here. I'm talking about the most gifted players walking the face of the planet. So they are still the agent of the change and they are still the agent of the performance without a doubt. But I think the environment now that I set for them to interact with is one that hopefully facilitates more adaptable, more authentic, more skillful interactions for them on a football field on a Sunday.
So there's a few things to unpack there. I think one of the first ones to begin with, as you mentioned, was some of the conventional models that you used early on and hoping that you get transferability into performance. Can you actually elaborate a little bit more on that? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about what were some of the original models and philosophies that you incorporated into your coaching and where you saw some of the limitations of that.
Yeah, great question here, Jack. I think for me, and I'll fast forward to the 2008 to 2012 type of time frame where I talked about that perfect practice, hopefully making perfect or hopefully making automatic that then would just unfold no matter what movement problem maybe was placed in front of the athlete. We aimed for some of that efficient and effective movement that we so often will gravitate to and maybe get enamored by when we see an elite performer move in a certain way. When we're thinking about the Michael Jordans, the Roger Federers, the Serena Williams, those individuals, the Messis, the like, like you can fill in the blanks there about those elite performers, and we can all envision what we see unfold for them. And so I was doing things with my players to chase that perfection from a motor action standpoint primarily. I was thought of or known as the movement Miyagi, where we were trying to repeat a certain way of doing, being, and acting, devoid of the alive movement problems that I knew were inherent to the sport itself. And I felt as though if we were to chase those things and perfect them, those positions, those patterns, and the execution of them through enough repetitions, that it would just show itself, obviously, in the most chaotic and dynamic environment that is the National Football League in its competitive world.
Yes.
And lo and behold, like some of the training methodologies that I utilized were isolated, decontextualized. We were trying to chase motor outputs, but also just this really efficient way of being or moving. But it was often like disrespecting, at least the way I look at it now, or maybe not even acknowledging the inherent truth, the inherent reality of sport, which is we can't execute a solution without first being presented with a problem. And those problems in sport are going to be changing, ever changing. They are dynamic. They are complex, meaning they are composed of numerous interacting component parts. They have different opportunities, different threats, different perturbations, different challenges to overcome each and every time that we would attempt to solve it. So it wasn't until I started to see players not behave in the way that we had practiced over and over and over again in a perfect type of fashion, where we were chasing rote repetition. I remember when I first read Nikolai Bernstein's idea of repetition without repetition, way back from the 60s, when he actually talked about that rote repetition should be discredited even way back then, because it's about the process of solving a problem again and again, as opposed to repeating the execution of some sort of solution. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And I started to realize that maybe my athletes that I was partnering with on field were performing in spite of me and the work we were doing, as opposed to because of me and the work and the methodologies that I was employing. So that led me to this place where I now adopt an ecological dynamics framework, which now places more of a spotlight, our scope and scale of analysis, on this performer and environment relationship in the mutual reciprocal nature of it. So probably a lot more can of worms there that I hopefully began to open up, and you can take us wherever it is that you think we should go.
Well, no, the thing though I think that's important to highlight here is I think sometimes when we think about human movement, we think of it in an overly simplistic fashion. And I see that in, you mentioned the comment of perfect practice and repetition. And particularly in complex open environment sports like NFL, like tennis, like soccer, do we actually expect to see the same movement repeated again and again by the same individual? To which the answer seems to be very much no, because the reality is the context and the environment is so dynamic and changing all the time. Now, let's actually explain a few things, because one of the things that you mentioned in your recent publication is you look at movement behavior as a problem-solving opportunity. What do you actually mean by that?
Yeah, great question, Jack. First off, I'll say this. Some of the threads I'd like to pull upon a little bit from what you said there in this mutual reciprocal exchange was around context, right? And how context of the movement problem that exists within the environment will shape or channel the content that is the movement solution. For we never step in the same river twice, for we're not the same man and the river's not the same either, meaning no two movement problems in sport are ever the same, so neither will any two solutions be the same. right? And I guess that for me, in the publication that you talked about from our 2023 paper, myself, Keith Davids, and Tyler Yerby wrote this paper around reconceptualizing movement behavior in sport as a problem solving activity. These problem solving activities will be underpinned by the intertwined, interwoven, interconnected processes of perceptions, cognitions, and actions. And it's in how those processes come together, how they perpetually feed into one another, that will underpin the movement behavior that we actually witness from an athlete. You mentioned some of those open, alive environments: NFL, rugby, soccer, tennis, mixed martial arts, the like. But the fact of the matter is this is actually a worldview as opposed to just a viewpoint or vantage point that we could study movement behavior in open chaotic sport through. Like at a certain level, everything is a movement problem solving interaction for us as a mover interacting with the world. Movement is life and life is movement, and we find our way through it, whether I'm walking my dogs or I'm out on a field with the players I partner with. I will be solving movement problems there, and every single time the problem will ask certain things of me or from me. The environment and I are in this constant reciprocal exchange of information based on who I am at that moment and what the environment represents. It's why a Bruce Lee quote that I happen to gravitate to and quote often myself is in Enter the Dragon. He says, it's like a finger pointing away to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger or you will miss all the heavenly glory that the finger's pointing at. You will miss the moon and everything that exists around the finger. And I think too often in the field, we concentrate a lot on the finger. What does that movement look like? What is the organism, the athlete, the individual doing? Without actually looking at what channeled the behavior of that athlete and how that athlete has a reciprocal exchange with their ever living environment. And I think it's there that once we reconceptualize movement behavior in this way, it starts to change the way that we might attempt to approach practice or training. Like we are trying to facilitate more skillful interactions, more skillful problem solving, and those processes that I talked about, we're trying to channel more attuned, intentional, and adaptable behavior from the performer, where the perceptions, the cognitions, and the actions can feed into one another, but also the performer themselves becomes one with that problem. And I think it's there, like, that becoming one with process is why the finger pointed to the moon to begin with, because there was something fascinating there. There was some opening, some opportunity, something that spoke to that person who's holding the finger, right? And for the athlete who's expressing themselves in sport, whether it's on an NFL football field or whether it's somebody just running in a straight line against 7 other performers, again, they're expressing themselves through their movement and they're trying to find their own functional fit with those problems in that respective environment. And I think it might seem overly conceptual or theoretical, but it has tremendous practical implications from my perspective. And hopefully we'll get into some of those here coming down the pipe.
Well, no, in fact, I think it'd be good to start with that now, because actually one of the things that you mentioned then is when you think about movement, is we can think about there are perceptual elements, there's cognitive elements, and then there's the action. And so when I think about from a high performance standpoint, and this maybe fit into the old model that you applied, we often think about trying to quantify and develop physical attributes, things like flexibility and strength, power, elastic function. You may then think about what particular elements you need to develop to then get the ability to accelerate faster, have a higher maximal velocity, be able to change direction. And as you mentioned, there's this idea that we just get this transferability from one to the other. Though I'm interested to hear a little bit more about how this actually then applies in the real world, and more importantly, how you then think about trying to quantify, determine someone's perceptual or cognitive ability to provide the actions that they need in their performance?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it requires somebody to adopt a systems thinking or a systems lens because we don't want to
Mhm.
think about them, even though we can neatly quantify them or define them perception, cognition, and action, or those elements as a human movement system interacting within other systems. It is a human movement system with those respective processes which are intertwined, interwoven, and interconnected with one another, meaning they are perpetually
Mm.
feeding into one another with tight circular causality. We need to get out of that frame of mind that they are separate from one another when a mover interacts with the dynamic environment in their world. And I think that's too often what
Yes.
people do, so they can use it as a
Mhm.
scapegoat. Like, I'm the strength and conditioning coach. I'm not supposed to
Yes.
dabble into this area of the perceptual or cognitive elements or processes, right?
Mm.
But instead, when we begin to look at movement behavior in this systems oriented lens, we start to respect the complex adaptive nature of the human movement system and how those respective processes that I just mentioned are always working in tandem. They just happen to be
Mm.
different, slightly different explanations of the same movement problem solving story. Because, as J.J. Gibson would say, we perceive to act and we act to perceive, meaning the two are tightly coupled together with one another. We also stand on the
Mm.
shoulders of giants, one of which that I mentioned before in Nikolai Bernstein, where he talked about dexterity, the ability to solve any emerging movement problem in any situation, in any condition. But Bernstein went on to say that dexterity does not exist in the movement actions themselves, but it is in how those movement actions interact with this alive environment with its challenges and perturbations. I'm painting that picture, Jack, because that starts to discuss, or we can start to discuss how that might exist in my real world, in my training environment, in
Mm.
my practice realm, because it's in the presentation of emerging movement problems in and across situations and conditions. So we're constantly changing movement problems. So we're constantly changing the context. So it channels
Mhm.
the content that is the movement solution. What information is there for the athlete to perceive? How that perpetually feeds into the decisions they make, the thoughts they think, the strategies they employ, and ultimately how they coordinate, control, and organize their movement actions in response to those problems. But I'm
Mm.
saying that because there's been many times where people have put down some of these breadcrumbs throughout history, and because
Mm.
it's this complex world of sport movement behavior, and we want to reduce it and simplify so we can try to understand it through our lens, when there's a lot of dimensions to it, I feel like that's a not doing justice and a service to the reality that our athletes find themselves within. We do it to be able to justify, like, well, that's not my job, that's someone else's job, so my
Mhm.
job stops here, right? Like, I'm just going to chase and
Mm.
give them more physical capabilities or qualities. But again, if we perceive to act and we
Yes.
act to perceive, and the two are tightly connected, we don't want to separate them from one another. And that, to me, is what an ecological
Mm.
dynamics framework did and is about. The scope and scale of analysis, the non negotiable, is the performer and environment relationship exists there. The movement behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I think that's why we can watch a Usain Bolt, fastest man on the planet, for a certain period of time, then try to go out on a soccer pitch, and the guy no longer looks fast
Mhm.
any longer because he has to
No.
solve problems which he's not adept to. We see it in my sport of
Yes.
American football with the combine, right? You got guys running around in the
Mhm.
dog and pony show that is the NFL combine, running around in their underwear, fast in a straight line, jumping high, so on and so forth. But that isn't football. That isn't problem
Mm.
solving because there are no football problems there to be solved. And so we see performers
Mm.
who shine there in that talent identification showcase. But then when they're thrown into the sport, the context has changed so dramatically that they can't possibly coordinate, control, and organize a solution that looks, feels, acts, and behaves anything remotely close to that which what they did when it was highly isolated, highly decontextualized. And so I guess I'm saying all that because until we actually begin to look at things through this systems lens, we can't ever begin to change our practical application of what it is that we do. There will be plenty of people who hear this podcast and think, okay, well, that just seems like this messy, chaotic conglomerate of all of these things and all these systems happening at play. And absolutely, it positively is. So they're going to go back to doing their own thing. They're going to decontextualize. They're going to isolate it and think that they're having the same impact that they would perceive to. But it's about actually like trying to understand the movement behavior for what it truly is. And I think it's starting there first and foremost before we can ever attempt to put our fingerprint upon it and assist our athletes with what it is that they're able to do out there.
And I think you actually framed it really well to begin with when you think about this concept of problem solving in this context of sports. It actually applies to any human problem in reality. But
100%.
there is this issue from a conceptual standpoint that we do like simplicity and we do like linear thinking. You know, we like the idea of what's the problem, what's the sport, here is the protocol, here is step 1, step 2, step 3, and here is the product or the outcome. Yet, you know, as you're highlighting here, the solution is that it is dynamic. And the outcome is constantly influenced by the input, which is that external environment and how that's constantly changing. How do you see this then influencing like real world behavior? Like, you know, how do you actually see this in being applied to sports settings and how we actually then can use these concepts in the real world?
Yeah, great question, Jack, because this is where the rubber meets the road. I mean, at the end of the day, I consider myself a practitioner. I consider myself a pracademic, if you will. I don't want to be looked at as somebody who's just theorizing or somebody who's just doing research or trying to come up with some concept or reconceptualization, if you like. That's not what I care about. I do care about understanding the movement behavior in sport at a deeper level, but ultimately it's to understand how I can assist athletes in adapting that skill out in the real world. And if it doesn't impact the real world, it doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot to me because I'm a coach and a practitioner after all. So this reconceptualization begins to have some practical implications. And that's the reason why in the 2023 paper that we mentioned earlier, we have the discussion section in there, not only what it means for researchers, what they have to begin to look at a little deeper level, the problem and solution, respecting that disposition of the problem and looking how it channels into the solving and the solution, and that solution process. But more importantly, what it means when it carries itself out onto the field, court, pitch, track, rink, wherever it is, right? And that aliveness that links the performer and environment, from my perspective, needs to be present. There has to be this mutual reciprocal exchange between everything that we do and the coordination, the control, and the organization of the movement behavior that the athlete then allows it to emerge in relation to it. That's why I always talk about this idea of becoming one with movement problems. I'm looking to set problems for my athletes to solve where I'm attempting to facilitate more skillful problem solving for them, or to try to channel and facilitate more skillful perceptions, more skillful cognitions, and more skillful actions that are attuned, intentional, and adaptable in relation to the problems. And again, these problems, we have to give up some of the control, which is what makes it messy and what makes people cringe or maybe get a little apprehensive. right? Like if someone
But
watches
particularly
my
in the short
learning,
term when you can't quantify it. Yes. I was going to say,
a
particularly in the short term when you can't quantify, because, essentially what you're describing here is we often get that nonlinear change after a period of time.
100%. And what we have is the nonlinearity of the process. So the athlete is about
Mm.
to fall off the bike a bit. Well, ironically enough, we all use the cliche like, well, it's just like riding a bike. But let's think about when people learned how to ride a bike. They didn't get on the bike
Yeah,
and
yeah.
someone told them exactly how to ride it and they did it perfectly and they did it in this linear fashion
Yeah.
that you're referring to. In order to learn how to ride the bike,
Yes.
they fell off the bike quite a bit in order to do that more skillfully.
Mm.
They had to go downhill, they had to go uphill, they had to go around a right-hand corner, they had to go around a left-hand corner. In Midwest America, where I grew up, you rode your bike on the gravel or on the asphalt or on concrete or on snow or back in the field or when it was raining or when it was sunny. We did it across situations and across conditions. And in the process, we
Mm.
learned to perceive and make decisions and act adaptively in relation to the bike, but more importantly, in relation to the ever changing environment. And so for me, that's the way my learning environments look as well. I view myself as a problem setter or a learning environment
Mm.
designer or then a facilitator of the movement problem solving process. I'm trying to nudge the perceptions, cognitions, and actions to become more tightly coupled, but to become more tightly coupled to the what is, as Bruce Lee would put it. The what is that's right there in front of
Mm.
us, the problem that is unique and peculiar versus every other problem that the athlete faced. And Jack, to the point that you made earlier, that's very difficult to quantify. It's very difficult to quantify the opportunities versus the threats that exist in those problems because the opportunities and the threats
Yes.
are going to be different for Shawn Myszka versus Jack, and Jack versus
Mm.
Barry Sanders, and Barry Sanders versus Usain Bolt, and Usain Bolt versus Messi. You kind of get where I'm going with this, right?
Mm.
Like, because
For
it
sure.
is hard to quantify, that complexity scares practitioners away from the inherent
Mm.
realities of sport movement behavior and what we might be able to do to facilitate it. It's why I believe that we all have to dive into the ideas of contemporary skill acquisition a little deeper in order to wrap our heads around this. Not suggesting that anyone's supposed to be an expert on movement behavior in sport necessarily, but what I am suggesting that if we begin to wrestle with some of these contemporary skill acquisition ideas, I mentioned one, alive movement problem setting. I mentioned the second one in repetition without repetition. All of a sudden we start to talk about representative task design. We talk about variability. We talk about authenticity. We talk about the emergence of creative movement actions. All of a sudden we start to talk about things that are a lot more relevant if you're watching rugby and I'm watching American football this week. Like that's I think where we have to exist more as a group and as a community.
Yeah, and the other thing I think of too as you explain this is again challenging the current framework we use, because I feel like, and this actually for me, I work much more from the rehabilitation sports medicine perspective, but I think particularly in our environment, um, we like to have that closed environment where we can control variables, because the idea of a sports medicine team is to mitigate injury, and the way that you do that is try and control the environment as much as you can. Yet the reality is, particularly from a performance standpoint, is you have to actually step into that unknown of no, 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 we need to provide complexity and variability in the environment, which, well, it's actually a question I did have for you, so we should bring it up now, is very important, not just from the performance standpoint, but actually I see that as very important from an injury mitigation standpoint. And that was a question I wanted to ask is, do you actually see this concept of the ecological dynamics and problem solving capacity of an individual for a movement behavior applicable both in that rehabilitation and performance side?
Yes, I absolutely do. And I love the question because typically, again, we wear our hat at that moment in time. And then we think to
Mm,
ourselves, whether it's in return to play, return to performance, rehabilitation, physical preparation, and strength and conditioning, and then the sport coach. And the only one that's really
yes.
even beginning to think about making things more open, making things more complex, and ultimately more dynamic and chaotic, which then would facilitate the variable or authentic and adaptable behavior from the performer, would sometimes be the sport coach. And I say sometimes because I see a lot
Mm,
of coaches in American football that are trying to get perfect practice as well and trying to reduce variability and
right.
reduce complexity, right? So that's why I say sometimes. But I think that this
Well,
paradigm can
that was
apply to
actually a question I
all.
was going to ask you, Sean. Sorry, I was just going to say that was the question I was going to ask you, Sean. Is some of the concepts you're talking about, do you actually see in good sports coaches already?
You see it in good ones, of course, from my
Mm,
perspective, but then we also see
yes.
it in the like we see the opposite. We see the exact opposite in the bad ones, or in the practice and learning
Mm.
environments where we're trying to hyper constrain and control. Like for many of the things
Yes.
that you mentioned there, even in the rehabilitation or when we're going down this path towards injury mitigation, like I think
Mm,
you see the coaches over on the other side that are trying to do the same thing in the sporting world. Now, typically, sports medicine or rehabilitation specialists are doing it to try to control for some of those variables and some of those things. But I think if we were to
mm,
shake up the snow globe everywhere a little bit and allow for a little bit more messiness, a little more variability,
mm,
what we get for the
mm.
athlete is them becoming more adept at solving problems wherever they are in the continuum. Again, I'm not saying for the
Yes.
rehabilitation specialist to just throw the rehabilitating athlete out to the wolves. Like, let's not get it twisted here. I'm not
Yes.
telling someone to just throw them into the most complex, chaotic world. Like, let's just get right back into the sport. Like, let's skip any of those steps in the process. But what I am
Of
suggesting is
course.
think to ourselves as to how we could inject more aliveness every step along the way, because that aliveness
Mm,
is likely to channel more interactions, interactions between the athlete and the problem that we're placing in front of them. That we're not chasing
mm,
rote rehearsal. We're not chasing some sort of perfect biomechanical technical model, no matter where we are along that continuum. We're not trying to get every athlete to look the same. And I know that sometimes those that might be listening to this at this point, Jack, particularly some of your peers in the rehabilitation space, might be cringing a little bit because you're like, what do you
of
mean
course.
don't chase some sort of technical model? Like
Yeah.
we're trying to get to some of those metrics, right? We're trying to get
Mm,
to
mm,
some of those tangible key performance indicators. But what we really
mm,
need to realize here is we want to invite the athlete to their own party, and that party involves problem solving. That party involves them interacting with a live environment. We might scale the complexity, we might scale the intensity, but we might find that if we focus on the authentic and honest mover, the expression of their movement every step along the way, variability could be the gateway to them adapting more quickly or more effectively, as opposed to putting these kid gloves on the athlete and kind of like treating them as like, oh gosh, you're
mm,
going to be okay here. Like we just ramped it up a
mhm.
little bit. We might get a little more variable, but again, probably the sport that we're rehabilitating them for is going to bring a lot of complexity. And why not start with the problem solving really right off the bat is kind of my call to action for all sports medicine professionals as well.
It's interesting. Even from an injury or pain perspective, think about something like low back pain. Obviously, very common, becoming more of a burden in society. Even the simple task of doing a forward bend task, they've shown differences between people who have long term back pain versus who are asymptomatic. You see variations in their motor control and as a result, slight variations in the mechanics of how they move by doing the task repeatedly. And so it actually fits in very perfectly with your concept at a much broader level from a performance in a much more open environment, where the concept of assuming that seeing the same movement pattern repeatedly is quote unquote good because it mitigates injury is actually not reflective of what we understand. And in fact, one of the issues that you see in the presence of persistent pain is a lack of variability in the motor control to complete a very simple task.
Yeah,
Now,
and that
a
point to
question I
something Nikolai
oh,
Bernstein said long ago, right? Like we look in and we dive
mm,
into Bernstein's work on the coordination and regulation of movements, and we're talking about in the 60s and before that. Again, when he was investigating repetition without repetition, where he told us right there the
mm,
inherent reality is that the more skillful performer isn't going to repeat that solution.
mm,
They're not going to repeat the means of the solution, but instead they're going to repeat the process of solving that problem for what it is. With fatigue and anxiety,
yes.
pain, injury, all of the constraints that are going to act upon the athlete. And that's
Mm,
just the internal ones we're talking about. Like if we look at it
mm,
broader, to your point, in the systems lens, and we begin to think about the problem and solution dynamics and the interaction between them, all of a sudden we realize like the importance of variability, much to your point, Jack.
mm. Have you read the book Range by David Epstein?
Yeah. hmm Yeah. And again,
You
this
know, he
begins.
talks about yes, yeah. Well, and that actually was a question I wanted to ask because he talks about when you think about sport, we can think about wicked versus kind environments. So when you think about things like American football, rugby, tennis, much more of a wicked environment because there's a lot more dynamic external variables that you have to respond to in comparison to something like track, say sprinting or weightlifting. Do some of the concepts that you're putting forward, do you think they actually apply to some of those more kind sports like sprinting or weightlifting or swimming?
I do, and of course that probably doesn't come as a shock as a surprise based on the conversation we've had up to this point. But that idea of range,
Mm,
Jack, basically begins to speak to an idea that I present in the 2023 paper as well. In that, in my view,
mm,
abundance precedes adaptability, meaning having more potential
mm,
strategies and solutions on the table or within the movement toolbox
mm,
will allow us to search for opportunities in the environment for solving or resolving said challenge or problem in variable
mm,
ways. So our adaptability is what really is skillfully emerging. And so that's what
mm,
Epstein and Range begins to speak to as well. This idea that diversity or degeneracy within the movement system actually precedes dexterity or the ability to solve any emerging movement problem.
mm,
But to your question, if we really strip it back and we think back to what I said, I don't know, probably 30, 40 minutes ago, in that no two movement problems are ever the same. Neither are any two movement
mm,
solutions. We never step in the same river twice. We are not the same man. The river's not the same either, right? If we believe that, then it doesn't matter how kind that sport really is. It brings pressure, anxiety, perturbations of some sort, right? Like, even if you think,
mm.
we'll use Usain Bolt as another good example here. We think Usain Bolt
Yes.
lining up in the Olympics against 7 other competitors, that race, even if he runs his race, will never be the same one. His constraints are changing,
Yes.
his physical, his emotional constraints, what information he might be
Mm,
connecting to. One is taking place in the practice environment, and the other one is taking place on the greatest, grandest of stage in the Olympics on a random
mm,
evening in, fill in the blank location. He looks over to his right and to his left, and he might see a Tyson Gay and an Andre DeGrasse, and he's seeing those other competitors. And then the gun goes off and he gets out of the blocks. And every step will be a little different than every step that came before in history for him. because it's all in the
mm,
interaction. Again, don't focus on the finger, focus on the finger and the moon relationship. We think about the context
mm,
that shapes that content. It's all different every single time. But because it's all different every single time, we can still prepare athletes for that if we allow the
mm,
facilitation of the problem solving to be in the ownership of the athletes themselves. And it can be tremendously freeing as a practitioner. All of a sudden, the athlete doesn't look at you like you're supposed to have every answer. And we often find ourselves maybe with being presented with questions from athletes where, like, I don't know, let's find out together. You're like, there's so much more of
mm.
a wayfinding journey as the practitioner, which I understand that some people in this space don't like to have either because they want to be that giver of truth. They want to be the expert who has all the knowledge that all the athletes look to, right? But none of us have all
And
those
that's
answers.
certainty. Yes.
Yeah.
No, no. Well, and interestingly, so my business partner, John Nicolosi, who often I do the podcast with, he's a sprint coach.
Okay.
He's been to a couple of Olympic games, so he's worked at the highest level, and it's something that we've talked about both off the podcast, but also on the podcast. Of one of the challenges that you have in those kind sporting environments, like sprinting, is being susceptible to monotony. Because the reality is there is less opportunity to create variability in what you do because there isn't this. Well, there are subtle adjustments you make into your external environment, but it's obviously much less complex or dynamic than, say, playing rugby or soccer. But interestingly, and that's one of the issues that you face because a simple principle to athletic development is to try and avoid monotony because there you see less opportunity to adapt and to grow. And that's actually probably one of the big challenges in those environments, is to make sure that because you are predisposed to having monotony or a lot of repetition, to not succumb to that. But then, we also see that, I guess, now in more complex sports because perhaps there is a preference to do things more simplistically or repetitively because it obviously creates more certainty in what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think, the thing that we have to continue to kind of think about there is, are we expecting all of our athletes to sort of behave in a certain way or to look like
Mm,
one another? And when, again, we think of the
mm,
sprinting, like I just happened to think of this. That's not the first time I thought of it, of course, but I think of it today in this conversation, right? Like, one of the other aspects that an ecological dynamics rationale begins to highlight and not avoid in the way that maybe some of the traditional dogmatic ways of thinking would, is that technical model, like, we're looking to break the rules to allow athletes to become
mm,
their best selves. We're looking to coach to their best model. Whereas typically in those
mm.
kind sports, we think we can reduce it and isolate it. So all of a sudden, all athletes start chasing some sort of perfect, idealistic, putative technical model for executing said, right?
Yes.
Whether it's running in a straight
Yes.
line or whether it's a clean and jerk or whatever it might be. But instead, like, to respect and harness the physical, mental, emotional constraints of the athletes themselves, so we coach to their best model. Like, that's a challenge in and of
Mm,
itself that I think there's a lot of athletes who probably got left by the wayside back behind because some coach started to fit a square peg in the round hole, started to try to fit some sort of model
yes.
to them when instead
Mm,
they actually weren't exactly like that, whether it was because of their own individual
mm,
organismic constraints, maybe their anthropometric features, maybe the way they viewed the world, maybe the experiences they've had,
yes.
their strength characteristics and the like, right? But instead, to actually allow us all to become more authentic and to channel and facilitate the authentic interaction for the performer themselves is another needed positive byproduct of adopting this problem solver
Mm,
paradigm. So all of a sudden, we begin
mm,
to sort of chase and reward things like abundance, variability, creativity, authenticity. Like these nuances that make us different from one another are the things we actually chase and lift up and attempt to facilitate more of. Again, if no two movement problems are the same and neither are any two movement solutions, two similar athletes might face two similar movement problems, but face it or resolve it in very different ways because they're not so similar after all. Like, that's the thing that I think we have to continue to think about in those sports additionally, that this type of a framework or mindset begins to, again, harness a little bit more than it would maybe traditionally in some of those kind sports that you mentioned.
You know, these topics also make me think about the importance of variability in youth development, and I think about some of the work that Avery Fagenbaum and
Mm-hmm.
Gregory Myers have done of showing that actually one of the worst things that you can do for a child or an adolescent is get them to specialize too early. And I think the same principles apply in how you're framing movements, where although obviously when you're an adult and you're an elite athlete, you may be working within one particular sport, but you actually need to provide context for how you build physical capacity and performance within that sport. But that actually sits on the foundation of making sure that you have even more broad variability in the development of an athlete, and how that's so important both from a performance and also an injury prevention standpoint, and helps to really make sense with thinking about some of these concepts of how that builds complexity and the ability for people to problem solve more effectively.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking to again, and this is maybe a bit of a theme or golden thread that is threaded throughout here, this conversation, in that
Mm,
this idea that abundance precedes adaptability or movement degeneracy could potentially precede dexterity. Again, if we have a
mm,
wider range of experiences and exposures to draw upon, we theoretically have
mm.
solved a wider range of movement problems and potentially
Yes.
adapted accordingly in relation to those problems. And again, that's why it's a world view of movement behavior as opposed to just a view within certain sports or within just sports as a whole,
Mm,
right? Like, I think that's why it has relevance, that if we're talking about injury mitigation all the way to the peak performance acquisition or development and ultimately transference to a competition, it all applies in the same way. From my perspective, we are all movement problem solvers. And we are all interacting
mm,
in a mutual reciprocal way with that environment that brings us the what is that is at that moment in time. The what is of that movement problem. And
mm.
it's why context and content are constantly feeding into one another.
Have you heard of the neuroscientist David Wolpert?
Yes. Yes. He actually, so he did a
Yes.
TED talk and that allowed him to become a little bit more popular. Oh gosh, it must have been what,
Yes.
2016, 2017, somewhere in that vicinity.
No, yeah, and it just a lot of his work and presentations I've seen of him, I think, fit in well with what you're saying. And in fact, one of the things that he thinks has led to the large development of our brain is just simply how we then manipulate our physical environment, because ultimately that is how we have an impact on the world. And part of that is being able to not just create movement, but be able to respond to the multiple inputs and variables that influence how we move and how we manipulate our environment.
Yeah, again, we want to think
Mm,
about the human movement system and those, even those cognitive processes, as being embedded ones, but they are embedded
yes.
in an alive environment, right? And again, whether we are
Mm,
talking about the kind or the complex and chaotic, whichever one we're talking about there, or the wicked, I guess, in the way that the range would present it. When we think about
sure.
it, every environment is complex. It will just vary in level
Mm,
of complexity, or maybe in predictability to a certain extent or degree. But again, it's always dynamic if we just learn to look at it and view it in that way. And all of a sudden, we can begin to see
mm,
how the entirety of the human movement system could or should become integrated to become more skillful in interacting with said or environments in
Yes.
this way.
How does technology fit into this? Because I'm thinking about things like maybe even virtual reality or motion tracking. Does that actually is that something that you apply practically, and does that actually give you some information about someone's problem solving ability, or alternatively using things like virtual reality to provide more external perturbations as a part of athlete development?
I think particularly with the VR path, it can be promising. I
Mm.
think right now it might not actually at least be as readily accessible or available as it needs to be in order to present problems that look, feel, act, and unfold maybe exactly as it will on an NFL Sunday, of course. Specifically because some of the
Mm.
nuances and the nature of the problem that make it complex, that make it chaotic, um, is not only unpredictable, but brings some sort of physical perturbation or challenge, maybe such as another big angry human chasing you or trying to take you to the ground, right? So that VR can represent that maybe more safely, but it might not allow us to turn
Mm.
the volume up or down to the extent that we need to. Um, but I think it presents some promising opportunities for the future, especially as it gets more alive and it allows for the true interactive nature. Like where we would get to interact with the environment, and the two do have a reciprocal relationship with one another. Because that, again, for me, is first and foremost. It's the reason why motion capture, because it's still so even the 3D motion capture is still just about the mover themselves. It's still very highly asymmetric
Mm.
on the organism or that singular athlete, right? Like it's not taking it maybe
Yes.
to the degree that we need to see what is that athlete looking at? How does that channel the decisions they're making or the timing of the decision, the strategies that they're employing,
Mm.
and ultimately the agency they have as they move in interaction with some sort of a live movement problem. So I think motion capture right now, it's still too much of a organism centric, asymmetric view on the organism. But VR presents
Yes.
numerous promising opportunities, at least from my perspective. I think we got to have
Yeah.
a few advancements yet because it still isn't maybe as advanced, particularly in representing what we would refer to as the specifying information within a problem, that information that
Mm.
one would need to pick up on, such as posture and kinematics of an opponent, maybe interpersonal distance between myself and the person I'm trying to evade, relative velocity values, bearing angles, gaps to the left and to the right, maybe the depth of the problem. It doesn't represent that as well as it probably should just yet, but I think we'll get there.
Mm.
At least I hope we will, because we'll be able to represent movement problems a lot more safely and probably be able to represent movement problems that we realistically can't right now. For example, if I have an
Mm.
NFL player who's coming to me, I only have access to 10 to 12 other NFL players at that moment in time. I don't have access to
Yes.
1,696. And if I have an NFL linebacker and I want him to get more
Yeah.
attuned and adaptable around the behaviors of an NFL running back, and I might have just one NFL running back in my learning environment, well, what about the
Mm.
others
Mm.
that could present different types of movement problems to that linebacker that he's going to be required to solve? Like there is some benefit there
Mm.
from this problem solving nature and the nuances of it that I think we will get to. We're just not quite there yet, I don't believe.
This is very much probably something that you very much anecdotal, but have you noticed that the people that you see as good problem solvers, obviously if in sport, they obviously usually have good physical attributes and have good athletic capacity. Do you see that there are certain, say, personality traits associated with people who seem to be better at problem solving?
That's a really good question. One I've spoke about a lot, Jack, on my
Mm.
movement plays of the week, or my all movement team that I highlight, and I feature one mover of the year every single year in the National Football League at Football Beyond the Stats.
Okay.
I've spoken about it there but I don't believe I've
Right.
ever been asked about it on a podcast, believe it or not. So kudos to you for kind of taking
Okay.
us down this rabbit hole. Because I do see a certain stylistic nature to someone's personality. If people who are listening right
Mm,
now follow my sport in American football, you can think about the Lamar Jacksons or the Christian McCaffreys, the Patrick Mahomes, the Travis Kelsey's. Like you see a stylistic nature and an expression of oneself. Obviously, with you
mm,
being where you are on the other side of the pond and down under, like you might be or have been exposed to somebody like an Israel Adesanya in the UFC and mixed martial arts. And you
mm,
see the stylistic nature of his personality and who he is. Like you see that
mm,
style then in the way that they express themselves in the movement behavior that's important to them, which is in Israel Adesanya's case in an octagon, or in my player's case on an NFL
mm,
football field, or in Messi's case on a
mm.
soccer pitch, and so on and so forth, right? Like every single one of those
Yes.
sports that we talk about, we begin to see kind of like what Bruce Lee would talk about when he would say the honest, authentic expression of oneself through one's movement is the thing that we're actually
Mm,
ultimately chasing. Use no way as the way, but to
mm,
allow that artist to be the agent of their movement behavior. And you can see an almost artistic nature in who they are. There's almost like a playful, creative nature to how they solve problems. Very rarely do those most dexterous performers in and across each one of those sports. Again, we could even use Usain Bolt, right? Again, in the timed sport, going in a straight line, that
mm.
would be around rote repetition to the traditionalist. And look at Usain Bolt in the
Yes.
way that
Yes.
he acts leading up to a race or after the race or even during the race when
Mm,
he's showcasing and showboating
mm.
to a certain degree, right? Like you see them
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
expressive in what they do. And I think it's not by surprise. It's almost by design. It's what leads
Mm,
to the dexterous movement behavior that we might see. That they, again, as Bruce Lee would say, use no way as the way. They're just finding their way through it in a water-like fashion. They're just adapting. They could flow or they could crash or anything in between.
mm.
And they're just so accustomed to kind of being in that adaptable frame and state of mind.
What are some high level recommendations you give to coaches and practitioners out there with some of this with what you've discussed? Because I think for some people who are in that very conventional model, what are steps that they can take to start then thinking about using an ecological dynamics approach and thinking about movement as a problem solving capacity or ability?
Yeah, good question. Because again, this is where the rubber meets the road, and hopefully we'll begin to speak to anyone, no matter what hat they might be wearing. I think there's a number of things
Mm,
here, Jack. First and foremost, if we fixate or focus our scope and scale of analysis on the performer environment relationship and the mutual reciprocal nature of it, and someone is viewing movement behavior in sport, I encourage everyone to zoom out and then zoom back in and kind of move back and forth between that. And what I mean by that is kind of the finger
mm,
pointing away to the moon again. Like, don't forget to look at the
mm,
moon and everything that's encompassed around the finger. Look at some of those
mhm,
things that might be channeling the movement behavior itself, first and foremost. Secondly, no matter what hat you're wearing, look to see how you can celebrate authenticity of the mover,
mm,
wherever, whatever step
mm,
along the way they are at. They might be very early in their return to play process. Look to see how you can celebrate authenticity there. They might be in track or gymnastics or weightlifting or rugby or soccer or American football. But look to celebrate that performer's authenticity. That, I guess, would be a second thing. The third thing as a practitioner, in that which what you're asking the performer or the athlete to do, is present more alive movement problems. Not even just trying to
mm,
change everything that you do, but think to yourself with anything you're doing, how can I make this more alive and channel more repetition without repetition, where no two movement problems are exactly the same. Neither are any two processes of solving that problem. Look to see how you can channel them. And if people begin to do that, I believe that they're going to be more faithful to an ecological dynamics rationale and framework, but they're also going to be able to maybe make some connections that they didn't before when they were sticking in that convention or that traditional or more dogmatic way, I guess, to a certain degree of thinking. So all of a sudden, you will start to see a lot more variability. You will start to see a lot more adjustability from the athlete, and you will start to hopefully hear some differences in experiences of the athlete themselves when you have an interaction with them. So if you invite them to that party, you equip them and create sort of this ownership process within that. I think people will start to maybe not become completely sold, but at least get a little closer to facilitating some of that skillful and adaptive way of doing and being.
Outside of your professional work, is there anything that you're currently learning about or exploring?
Oh, interesting. This this is a good question because it's one that, again, I look up to Bruce Lee, who did a lot of different things.
Mm,
Bruce Lee was everything from an actor and a martial artist, as people know, to a cha-cha dance champion. And he allowed each one of those
mm,
respective endeavors or arts to inform the others, right? So something that I've
mm,
often talked about is taking it or something from anywhere you can find it. And one of the things that I've
mm,
actually has begun to bleed into some of my professional work to a certain degree, but it happened sort of by chance and happenstance, in that I am a sports car enthusiast. And I've often been able to
mm.
make parallels between what happens when I drive my car a little too fast and what happens for the athletes that I partner with, right? Well,
Yeah.
recently at Emergence, we've contracted with a high-level motorsports organization to begin
Mm,
adopting some of these ideas of contemporary skill acquisition from a problem solver paradigm and underpinned by an ecological dynamics framework to high-level motorsports. So, in the
yeah,
middle of the
okay.
National Football League season, some of my personal hobby has bled into my professional work to a certain degree, but I've spent a lot of time in this American football season these last, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks since this contract was signed and we started to look at the reality of this. So that's
Mm,
something that I've been thinking about because it's something that many of us do, right? Many of us drive,
mm,
whether we're doing it from a sports enthusiast or motorsports enthusiast standpoint, or whether we're just driving to work from point A to point B or just going to get groceries in the afternoon. Like
mm,
we're all driving, we're all experiencing it. I know my business partner, Tyler Yerby, here at Emergence, who co wrote a number of papers with me, he goes hiking a lot, and that is his
mm,
personal hobby. So, like, my point with saying that, which what I did earlier, Jack, around this being a worldview of movement
mm,
behavior, it starts to
mm.
inform how we view movement behavior in sport as well.
Yes, and this is so much of I feel like a discussion about philosophy than it is just about concepts as well, because so much of it is about your perspective on the world and then how that actually translates to something like sport. And it's interesting, you talk about Bruce Lee being someone that's very influential on you. It helps to make sense of why you come at it from this perspective. Shawn, thank you very much. That was a great conversation. It's a very insightful conversation too that sort of goes beyond the common conversations you may have with a researcher where you're often focusing on a very simplistic or very focused idea. So I think there's a lot of great things to take away for our listeners to think about how this then applies to their setting.
I appreciate it, and to kind of steal an idea from Bruce Lee as we sort of leave listeners here. No matter what I had to say today, live and breathe by the Bruce Lee adage of using your own experience, absorbing what is
Mm.
useful, discarding what is not, and adding what is uniquely your own to anything I might have said. So hopefully there's some things that made some people think about some things a little differently. there might also be some things, my friend, that people are like, well, Shawn is absolutely crazy and completely off of his rocker. I'm not going to adapt that at all. And then there might be some other things where, like, I can take that and I can add what is uniquely my own and authentically utilize that in my own environment. At least that's what my hope is for anyone who's gotten this far and this deep into the listen of this podcast. So I appreciate you for the platform and the opportunity, this canvas, if you will, for us to paint with our thoughts upon.
For people who are interested to follow your work or what you do, Shawn, are you active on social media, website? Where are the best places to find who you what you're doing?
Yeah, there would be three places in particular. The first one would be, I mentioned Emergence. We are a movement skill education company. It is at Emergent Movement, MVMT. So emergentmvmt.com.
Yeah.
Definitely check out some of the blogs and our free material. We have a podcast called the Adaptable Athlete Podcast that my colleague Javier Miller Estrada, my colleague at Emergence, runs and operates, but you can hear a bunch of podcasts from me on there as well. And then two places in particular, Football Beyond the Stats, which I mentioned earlier. If people want to dive into my movement plays of the week, my mover of the year, all of those things, if they really want to geek out about skillful movement behavior on an American football field, that would be the place. And then also, I am very active on Twitter/X, whatever the kids are calling it these days. And you can find me at Movement Miyagi. So I mentioned it earlier. Just type in my name, Shawn Myszka, or easier yet, type in at Movement Miyagi. And you're going to see me ranting and raving about some of the topics that we talked about over the last hour plus as well. Probably a little bit too often, but hopefully people come along for the ride in one of those places.
Shawn, again, thank you very much. And again, to our listeners, please do like, subscribe, leave a comment. It's a great opportunity to be able to spread our work and get more people exposed to what Shawn's doing as well. So thank you very much again, Shawn.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate you.